to 411 T Street, unfiltered conversations on mental health and the issues in society that impact us all. This is where we break down the barriers and explore the topics that intersect with the challenges of modern society. I'm Dr. Milan Bray, and each week we'll dive into raw, honest discussions on the systemic issues that affect us all. We'll hear from experts, thought leaders, and everyday people offering real stories and actionable insights to help you achieve an understanding of the issues that matter most. No filters, no sugarcoating, just real talk. Welcome to 411 T Street. Today, we're going to hear from an expert named Angela. She's a thought leader, and she has she's a storyteller. She's a facilitator. Oh, that's a fun word. She's a facilitator. She's a change agent. She's a storyteller. She's an educator. She is a Jackie of all trades. She's an intuitive. I don't think there's anything she can't do. So let's jump in and learn a little bit more about her. But I want to say that going back to how Angela and I met, we are both part of what's called the G100 in a wing called Values and Volunteerism. And most recently, we had, and I just forgot to turn on my light, so I'm going to get real bright right now. So look at that. And there we go. Yes, so much better. We most recently had a summit for the G100 related to values and volunteerism and what that really looked like with regard to industry, nation, and society. Wait, no, how'd that go? Cause, industry, nation, and cause. All right, not enough coffee. Yes. Anyway, so which brings me to the fact that Angela hails from South Africa. So we are definitely in different time zones here. It's early by my standards, and I'm not sure what time it is for you. But there was so many topics that came up within our summit. And oh gosh, if anyone turns on the TV, I think we can all agree that the world is really not aligned with their values. I mean, to be fair, there's some countries that might be crushing it a little bit more than others. I think Finland might be one of them. I don't know, maybe not. But we really have some systemic issues that need to be addressed, and yeah, that's in itself a pretty loaded conversation. But let's circle back to your part of the globe in South Africa and talk about what's going on there and how we can really think about values and volunteerism as a cornerstone in our nations and also our industry. And, you talk a lot about choice, which is beautiful. So the floor is yours.
Okay, so I just want to pick up on something that you were saying, and I do believe that nothing happens in a vacuum, and that we have, regardless on whether we're on the light, on the side of light, or on the side of the shadow, or some people refer to it as the dark, humankind is always in balance between light and shadow. And even in the shadow, there are values. They may not be values that lift up consciousness. They may not elevate us into a space of the way that we really would like to be embedding values around addressing all these systemic issues. But, as an example, take a gang culture. They have values. The fact that we don't agree with their values are still there. And part of the work that we've been doing with you collectively is to elevate those values that take us into unity, into being interconnected, into the greater good, into values like love that you speak a lot about, peace, hope, the higher order values. And so I think when we start to really look at what the systemic issues are, part of that is getting underneath in terms of understanding what people do value. And if people are valuing things like greed, and they value things like that sense of connectedness that people have, and I'm using gangs as an example because they're prevalent everywhere. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, they are there.
Mhm.
And the sad part about it is that they're recruiting kids younger and younger and younger. I mean, you go back into Africa where they recruit child soldiers. What's different in a gang of somebody who's being put through an initiation or a refusal to actually join a gang in the New York City suburbs? Same, the same situation is happening. And for me, part of that is, and you speak a lot to this in terms of integrating this into the schooling system, right from kindergarten all the way through, is around the fact that we're not doing it. I mean, we've had things like, and I'm sure it's the same in the States, where we've had things like because the Constitution is, our Constitution is accepting of all races, colors, creeds, and all of that stuff, and that you can't really impose on anybody else. They've taken things like religious instruction out of the syllabus. Now, part of and life orientation has become a joke in terms of what they are teaching children and high school children, specifically, I'm referring to here, in terms of what values are. They're not. They're not preparing our youth for the world that they're going into. Young people don't have the wherewithal or the resilience to be able to withstand the energies of the bullying that goes on if they don't join gangs, etc., etc. It's not the kind of that's the shadow side. On the other side, there are I mean, we saw two young, beautiful women who joined the summit who are in their either late teens, early 20s, who are just a hallmark of the absolute hope that we have within our youth as well, who are subscribing to the higher order values and are very conscious in terms of addressing and being part of the solution to address some of the systemic issues. And when we come back to South Africa is like this is my view, okay? So it's my intuitive read and my intuitive view on what goes on here. I don't kind of get too embroiled in the politics and stuff because it's a waste of time and energy. I can't impact on that other than the work that I do specifically myself. But when we start to look at what goes on here, South Africa is like a mini me United, like the mini me United States. So whatever's going on, you take a South African youth and you put a New York youth, for example, on the same platform in the
Yeah.
subway. They dress the same. The accent is going to be the thing that will distinguish them, but the energy is exactly the same. The big bling around the neck, the peak caps, the
Should I
jeans.
apologize to you in advance for that? Although
No,
I'm not dressing the youth of America, so there's take that out there.
no, not at all. But what I'm saying is that it's endemic, right? It's a worldwide thing. I don't know that it can be isolated. It might be more intense in some areas than others, but I don't believe that this is the change. And I believe we're going through incredibly turbulent times because of a new energy coming in. And it's like childbirth. When you give birth to, I mean, it's freaking revolting giving when those hips open and this baby's got to come out through.
Yeah.
And I never forget what was the movie? Um, Look who's talking, I think it was Kirsty Allen, when she looked at John Travolta and she says to him, "You try and give birth to something the size of a watermelon out of the hole the size of a mango." He says, I mean, maybe you'll be able to relate to that. We're in a birthing process. We're birthing the new. And that's why the work that you're involved in, the work that we're doing together on the G100, the work that you do with Kitty Go and with Tay is so important in the sense of bringing in and ushering in the new consciousness. And always there's light and shadow. It always will be in perfect balance. And the more light there is, the more we're going to be seeing the elevation of the shadow because it's in balance.
Yeah, yeah, I mean we've heard about that in psychology. Jung talks a lot about that. We all have a shadow self and the world reflects a shadow. And I agree with you. Yes, we all have values, whether those are good values or bad values, we all value something. That's true. Um, but I think within the construct of values, whenever I think of values, I think about like a moral code, how a true north. And I think that's the thing that's lacking. And it really does come down to education, but I think
Yep.
it goes down even further. Uh, so backing up to education a little bit, obviously, I don't know what it's like in South Africa, but here in the United States, the amount of quality time that parents are spending with their children is disproportionately low.
Yep.
On an average, it depends upon what study you're looking at, what research, Some are a little bit more extreme, but they say, like the average mom spends about 4 hours, 4 to 12 hours a week, quality time. I'm not talking
Yep.
about driving your kid to soccer practice or taking them to the grocery store, but like that real quality time where you're sitting there, you're having the conversations, maybe you're playing a board game, whatever, kicking it old school in some way. And fathers spend disproportionately less time with their kids. Now, the reason that with regard to the work that I do, that I kind of focus on education, is because what I don't think a lot of people think about is that kids are spending 32 to 40 hours a week in front of educators.
Yep.
Now, this is very problematic in the fact that every educator comes with their own set of baggage, and we imprint on people, right? Just exactly like you said, like, people look to the United States as kind of, what next? And, oi, fun fact, don't do that. Yeah, I mean, it's real, real messy, right? But we have to have a moral compass. And I think beyond education, I think the conversation really needs to go within the family dynamic. We're not
Absolutely.
having a conversation anymore about the roots of family and how that impacts kids.
Absolutely.
All the mental disorders, all the challenges that everybody's have. That includes here in the United States. There's a very fundamental breakdown of what is happening in the family because we're all chasing the capitalistic dream. No matter where you live, we're all trying to get something, right? And if
Yeah.
and if you're saying from a South African perspective, you're looking to the West and the United States to be the model for that, oy vey.
Okay,
Have you
so
turned on
come
the TV? It's a hot mess over here. I'm just saying, don't do that.
well, it's been a hot mess, yeah. I mean, we know South Africa's been the hot mess of the world's conscience for so many decades with apartheid and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
And what we've had, I mean, you go back into the fabric of African society where you've got the African race is much more dominant than the European Caucasian race, and it's just those are the numbers.
yeah,
But what you're seeing so these when we start to talk about systemic conditions, you've got colonialism, which has also happened in the States.
yes,
You also had, so not just in South Africa, in Africa, I've been into Rwanda, I've been into a couple of African countries where it's pretty much the same. So you had all the colonists coming from, whether it was France, whether it was South Africa, I mean, England, whether it was Germany, Holland, doesn't matter. You had colonialists coming in and colonizing and trying to tame the so-called natives. And I say that in the sense of the
yeah,
historical word, not as a labeling thing. And then you had the withdrawal, they withdrew. And what they left behind was a society of learned helplessness. And I'm talking specifically in Africa. And I mean, you don't only see learned helplessness in Africa, you see it elsewhere in the world, but very endemic to Africa. So you have that. Then we have codified into the laws, in South Africa specifically, the whole question of apartheid and white is right and all the rest of that stuff that went on. Then we have things like HIV/AIDS, and where a lot of parents died very early, leaving child-headed households,
mm,
where children of 13, 14 were left to parent younger siblings in the absence of grandparents. Or you've got older parents or the grandparents who are really getting into their old age, now having to raise a second family. Then we've got things like high divorce rates. We've got narcissism on the rise, like we've never seen before. We have things like, well, of course, we have COVID. We also have single parent households
yes.
under increasing pressure and
Same here,
incredible.
disproportionately.
I'm one of them. I am one of them. The economic pressure that they're under, but also you've got people even in co-joined households, regardless of whether they're male, female, same-sex parent, doesn't matter. You've got people who are taking on two, sometimes three jobs just to make ends meet. And so is it any wonder that when we start looking at the statistics of the average mom being able to spend 4 hours of quality time, if she's lucky, with her children,
Yeah,
and then comes the guilt and all the stuff that goes with that, because she's not doing what she needs to be doing, and the whole balance of teachers almost having to step into the role of parenting children because the parents are under so much stress and pressure.
Yes.
And part of that is how do we start to alleviate that and create simple tools, simple things that, and simple rituals that people in families can start to get back together again without feeling like they're under just another lot of things that they have to add to their to-do list. Um,
But
the
I
amount
think
of
that
sleep.
that comes down to values though also because it's about what we value. Now, I'm not saying, I mean, yes, everybody's got to work, everybody's got to pay their bills. But, here in the United States, one thing that I talk a lot about is I spent probably more of my adulthood outside this country than I have inside this country. Lived all over the world. I've I've seen a lot. Very blessed to have seen that. Every time I come back to this country, I have a little bit of a reverse culture shock because what this country values, and I'm gonna take a swipe at the United States. Who needs a 13,000 square foot home?
Mm,
What?
yeah,
Why? Who needs, the biggest car, the what we value and what we're chasing is not sustainable because we always uh, and even if you don't want a 13,000 square foot, maybe you just want a 3,000 square foot home. 3,000 square foot is going to get filled with stuff. And then you're going to need a 3,500 square foot home. And then you're going to
yep,
need bigger, we can never get enough. And so we've got to go back to those fundamental values. And I think people are really, really stressed not just because of politics and which is obviously a huge issue, but how do we keep paying for our stuff?
yeah,
And I
yeah.
think, it's and I'm not saying that other countries don't do that because absolutely 100% at South
All
Africa
over.
is not the only country that looks to the West to be their God forbid their moral guide because that I don't even want to throw that out there. If fashion advice, moral guide, political guide, like this is not the country necessarily to look to. We've got to look to our own fundamental values and what that looks like for us. And but I think a bigger problem is that just in general, like you said, there's more narcissism, there's all these things just kind of floating around in this weird kind of vacuum. How do we get back to the basics? Love, truth, peace, right conduct, nonviolent, and not this nonviolence, and not this sliding scale of what those things mean, but these really core fundamental values that are taught in all religions. They're in all the doctrines. Like nobody's not talking about, love your neighbor. Like that's a pretty that's a pretty basic rule. But I think, how do we get ourselves out of this narrative of the only way that I'm successful is if I have fame and stuff. Like, where do we go back to? I'm
Mm.
successful when I'm a good person, when I'm a kind person, when I'm a person who gives back to my society. One of the jokes that I kept making in the summit that I heard on America's Next Top Model is one of the girls saying, I mean, it was so profound. I was like, oh my God, like I've learned something. You know, um, yeah, I mean that and how to smize. But what? One of the things you kept saying is service is the rent we pay for life, and we have to go back to service. And then it seems like the
Yeah.
only way, I don't know about in South Africa, but here in the U.S., it seems like people only want to help and serve each other when there's crisis.
Or
When
when they're setting it for them,
yeah,
not because,
exactly, exactly. Well, that
not
takes
because,
me back to the
yeah.
the Friends episode where Phoebe and Joey were trying to figure out what true altruism was, and they're like, "There's none." Yes.
I think for me, it starts. I mean, I'm not being trite when I say this, but the Gandhi saying of, if what's that saying
Be the
about,
change you wish to
change,
see.
yeah, be the change you wish to see in the world.
One of my
And I'm not
favorite.
saying that at a trite level, and I'm not saying it here either, because we also intellectualize everything and we talk from our head, we don't talk from our heart. But for me, when we're starting to talk about transformation, we're starting to talk about change, we're starting to talk about how do we go into almost a global change process that we elevate consciousness. It starts with me. And it starts with me smiling at somebody instead of scowling at them because I've stood in the queue for 5 minutes. Just greeting that person. It starts with me receiving, even as far as getting a phone call from a creditor, for example, going, you want to, when are you paying your bill? It starts with me being kind to that person on the other side of the phone instead of wanting to climb through and bash them. Um, you know, it's we talk about random acts of kindness, and it's not about being trite and not doing it because I can tick a box and go, oh, I've done my kind thing for the day. But I
Mhm.
just want to kind of also circle back to things like influences.
Mm.
The whole, I mean, the way that that whole movement of influences is actually just with the internet, with all the access that people have, this whole and the whole way that the marketing world is going, well, they've got so many followers, so let's pay them a whole lot of money for them to sell more of the stuff that people don't need anyway.
Mhm.
That whole cycle of the materialism, 3D ego energy linking to influences and all of that stuff that goes with it. And now when you ask young people, what do they want to do? Oh, no, I want to be an influencer.
Yeah.
What does that actually, what does that mean? However, when we turn it on its head and we use it for good, it can have the same kind of impact.
I
But it
I
still
agree with
starts with me. It still starts with me and the choices that I am making to honor those values. And I know that when we talk about values, we're talking about that stuff that sits right underneath the iceberg. We're not talking about stuff that's sitting at what I value as in material possessions. We're talking about who we are and how we present ourselves into the world in terms of the values that we hold. And
I,
so,
I think first of all, the idea of an influencer is just silly to me. But it's also quite dangerous because if we look at some of the things that are we're being influenced, it's absolutely dangerous. Especially for women. It's really, really dangerous for women. But all that said, I think we could say collectively around the world we've been so desensitized to it. Well, let me back up. If I were to put on a show right now that was all about the good things that were happening in the world, like all we were doing was watching good stuff, there was just no drama, it was just people doing good. Like nobody would care, nobody would watch it. It would get really shitty ratings and it would go off air because
yep,
we are so predisposed to watching the garbage. And now, we continue to change our neurosynaptic connections so
yep,
that we need more and more and more drama to get those endorphin kicks, right? And I see this, and we've all felt it. If you come out of, we're going to go to the extreme. You come out of a horror movie or you come out of a rom-com, there are completely different feelings. But we are watching the horror movie, whether it's the news, whether it's the internet, like we are watching the horror movie all the time.
yep,
And so if you
yep,
don't think that your brain is going to change, this goes into the rule of five. The five things that we hold dear to us. And if you're spending a lot of time on the internet or on your phone or whatever you're consuming, that's one of your five. Your
yep,
best friend might be, one of the rule of five. Maybe you have, you have a good relationship with one of your parents, your significant other, whatever that is. But you have to remember that everything that not you, we all have to remember that everything that we watch, we consume, we see, we hear it's changing us at a
yep.
cellular level. So the
And
problem is that we're so bombarded with all of this, and that takes up so much of our time. Well, I don't know what the statistics are. I need to pull up my Google, but I think it's kids watch or on the internet upwards of or watching some device, let's just put it that way, upwards of 7 hours a day.
yeah, no, it's ridiculous. And also, it feeds into the collective consciousness. So not only are we dealing with it in our own cellular structure, but we also are infiltrating that same energy into the collective consciousness. And it's that typical thing of what we focus on, what we think, so as we think, so we will manifest. So the more we are thinking and engaging in those, for want of a better word, darker, deeper, yuckier energies, the more we are manifesting that, because thought always, form always will follow thought.
Mm.
So part of that is, and again, you go to the networks, it's about money. They're making money. They make money off horror movies. And the more horror movies they're putting out, the more people are watching them, the more that's where the movie budgets are going. I mean, the number of, for me, and again, because we now become really global villagey with the internet, the more you look at what kind of movies are coming out and where money's being spent on the futuristic stuff, the end of the world, the horror movies, the mass murderer, iconic documentaries, all that garbage feeds into the collective.
Mhm.
So the contrast and the question comes back to what you're saying, how do we change that narrative? And
Yeah.
again, for me, it comes back to, I always, and I think I said this on my talk on the summit, or I often use this as an example. How does a man like Nelson Mandela come out of 20 odd, 30 odd years of incarceration on Robben Island? How does he come out deeply entrenched in the values that allowed a peaceful transition into a country that should have gone to be blown to smithereens in terms of what could have happened in this country?
Yeah.
Because he believed in the values of Ubuntu and he lived them. Yes, he was a freedom fighter, and yes, all of those things, but that went back to his values as well. I'm not going into the political merits, positive or negative. I happen to be a white South African, having grown up in the apartheid era and being on the other side of little things like playing with the we used to call them maids, they're not like that anymore, but the home cleaners playing with their children in the garden and then all of a sudden not being able to go to school with them. So
Mm.
we had another experience of what apartheid was, living with, we didn't know when police were going to come up to into our property to come and arrest people. We had no idea of what was going on with all of that stuff. Um, and because I was a child growing up through that, I wasn't an adult going through that. And so you have this iconic man who has been influenced through his lifetime by the teacher who saw his potential in the Eastern Cape, who then went to university, who had a lecturer who saw his potential, who in his political freedom fighter years, working with people like Oliver Tambo, who he was his role model. And that's part of it, is when we start to come back to pragmatically, how do we start to do this? It's about how do we stand up as leaders? How do we stand up as role models, carrying a message to
Mhm.
people in however small or big our sphere of influence is? Somebody somewhere ignited that potential in him, communicated to him these beautiful values of Ubuntu that he lived by, that he honored. And coming out, and I'm not kind of, yeah, he's a human being and he was a man and he had his faults, as he would always admit to as well. But you have somebody who's so deeply entrenched in those values. Gandhi is another one who ended up having an influence over millions of people worldwide. And it's that. How do we then, as educators, because both of us work in the space of education, how do we become the catalyst? We never know with somebody that we might be teaching that
Mhm.
that could be the next person who has that kind of global influence. We don't know.
Yeah.
So part of it for me is me just showing up, me doing what it is that I do, because I don't, I mean, I've got some of the women that I used to work with when I was in the hotel industry many years ago, over 20 years ago, that I took on a middle management development program, who are sitting as general managers of six-star hotels in Doha, in Oman, being incredible women in Arabic countries, which is like unheard of.
Hmm.
Those are the kinds of things that we get to do as educators. We never know who
Hmm.
that next person is going to be, that we may have had just a little bit of that flame that lights a spark in somebody else.
Yeah,
And
and
that
I,
for me is,
oh, sorry.
yeah, no,
Well,
that's the
I,
pragmatic way of getting down to grassroots and doing what we need to do. Sorry, carry on.
and I think the thing with educators, just in just in general, we know that the communication words are only 7% of what
Yep.
people really take from us. It's really about what we It's my version of integrity. It's alignment with your thoughts, words, and deeds. So we, even educators and people, we can have these conversation all day or days. But when we walk out that door, do our actions align with our words? And I think with educators, um, and parents and people in the world, it doesn't make any difference. It's just, what are we showing the world? What are we doing? And educators have a particularly difficult road to hoe simply because they have to not only teach subjects, but they also, whether they realize it or not, they also have to teach the moral code. Now, that
Yeah.
does not mean that they should be talking about their principles and their religion and their politics and their pronouns or any of that nonsense. I'm not talking about any of that. How are they treating people? How are they treating people? Are they good to kids? One of the we have big conversations here in the United States about teachers sharing their message, whatever that is, and become a political hot button because there are teachers out there who are sharing their politics, they're pushing their religion, they're pushing their
Their own story and their own
LGBT
narrative.
narrative, whatever the situation is. That's not what we're talking about. That needs to stay out of it. What we
Yeah.
need to be doing is showing, and going back to these very, very simple concepts, we need to be showing kindness. We need to be showing equanimity. We need to be showing compassion and empathy. All the rest of this stuff, it doesn't need
Yeah.
to be. And
There's
one thing I do want to say, because you keep bringing up an Ubuntu, and I know that a lot of people who are watching or listening probably have zero idea what that means. And I just want to share a story, and then you can explain what that means. When I was first introduced to Ubuntu, I was told a story, and I love the story. There was a man, he was in Africa, and he told he had a big, huge basket of fruit, and he put it at the end he put it far away. And he said to the kids, I want you all you're going to race, and the first person to get to the basket will get the basket of fruit. And so he said, on your mark, get set, and they all held hands and they ran to the basket together. And the guy
uh,
and the guy was like, "What? Wait, what? What? Why did you do that? What I meant was like one per." And he's like, "No, that's not how we roll. We do this together." So can you explain just before we go on what Ubuntu is? Because it's just so people are like, what does that story mean?"
Okay, I'll pick up on that now. This is one thing I also wanted to just say in terms of the context of education and what's going on. Number one, the syllabuses are out of date, completely out of date for the model world. Number
Oh,
two, what we're
man.
seeing is that education is not valued. The manner in which a lot of the teachers are treated, I mean, we're seeing it here all over. So, you get when my parents get called to the office, to the principal's office when we were growing up, it was like a serious thing. Now, when parents are getting
It was
called to
our
the office,
fault.
yeah, yeah, yeah. The responsibility was sitting with us.
Mm,
Now, when parents are getting called to the schools because their children are acting out and all of those kinds of things that are happening, the parents are lambasting the teachers for
mhm,
not doing what the parents actually should be doing. So you've got this whole role reversal, which is actually incorrect, exacerbated by the stats that you were talking about earlier on around how much time moms spend with their children, dads quality time with their children, how much work, how much the family fabric is ungluing itself in terms of values. And all that expectation and responsibility is being put onto the shoulders of educators. And
yeah.
we see things like books being, I mean, there was a video that went wild here in South Africa of a student throwing a book at a teacher, and the teacher actually getting a cut on it. I mean, that's a mild compared to some of the stuff that's happening within schools. So just I think part of the change for me is really right sizing and elevating the profession of education, the profession of nursing, those kinds of professions that have always been seen almost as the second class. Well, if you can't become an accountant, then you can go and become a teacher. That kind of rubbish. That belief that says there are those who do and those who can't do teach. What a lot of rubbish. because the teachers are responsible for the future RT geniuses, the doctors, the engineers, all of those people who are going to be adding skills into the world as we grow along, all starts with education. Now, to come back to South Africa and Ubuntu, because that's also part of their education process, is that Ubuntu is very simply, it means I am because of you. I do not exist without you. You and I are in an engagement of Ubuntu because I am able to have this conversation with you because you have created the space for it to happen. If you didn't have me, you wouldn't be having a show, you'd be having a monologue. So it's that kind of thing, is that I do not exist without you. What that brings into play is interconnectedness, is unity. The story of the children running towards the fruit is because they've been taught to live in community with one another. There is no competition, there is collaboration, there is community, there is connection. So the saddest part about it, and what makes my heart very sore, is that these values that are deeply entrenched around a belief system, around an African spirituality, have been bastardized, have been put into yet another let's do the Ubuntu thing as another thing we do, as opposed to who we are. And a lot of the fabric, because of the things that we've seen, where that connection between grandparent and grandchild, which is very much how the traditions were, and same as the Native American Indian traditions, where the oral tradition would convey the values through narrative, through storytelling, from the grandmothers to the youth. Whether it was the warriors to the boys who went through their rites of passage, or whether it was the women who would, the grandmothers who were teaching the mothers and the maidens. And even if we think about our own, on the Western socialization, things like reading stories to children, communicating that kind of value, as in, those are the things that we, I mean, I still remember going to church as a child at the age of 5. I can remember Bible verses from when I was a child more today, those verses, than I can anything else that I've learned as an older person. And so, things like do unto others as you would have them do unto you, some of the narratives and the Bible stories that were taken, because that's the purveyor of conveying values, is through a lot of story and storytelling. And so when you look at the indigenous cultures, their education system is through story, is through narrative, is through fable. They also have this beautiful tradition of giving the children a conundrum, so presenting them with a scenario, but then having the children work out the answer for themselves and coming back to the grandparents and saying, this is what the answer is. And the grandparent would say, yes, you've got it, or no, you need to go back and do a little bit more work on figuring that out. So teaching them how to think, not what to think. And so when we start to talk about the Ubuntu teachings, we look at the Native American Indian teachings as well. They are deeply embedded in the truth of values that we speak about. They're not the only ones. Any of the Aboriginal cultures, Buddhist traditions, all of those things, many of the world's religions are still entrenched in values. And so for me, when we start to focus on, I mean, Desmond Tutu is quoted often as saying that Ubuntu is Africa's gift to the world, because it is steeped in these values of compassion, of caring, of love, of service to others, of service to the collective whole. They have their within the African context as well, they have their own system of justice. They have meetings called lekgotlas, which is where the men of the society, it's still pretty patriarchal, but there's a very interesting fact behind that, where the men come together in the men's council and they will then make decisions. However, the power of women sitting behind that, men go home, they consult their women. They bring back what the women would be saying into their tribal meetings, and the discussions are then made there. Also, you have so much reverence in the traditions of the elders. Have a look at what we're doing with our elders today. We put them in, we lock, kind of put them out into pasture because nobody wants to kind of take care of them. And so that disconnect, for me, one of the biggest disconnects around values is the disconnect between the grandparent, the elders' energy and the youth, and
Yeah.
bringing those two together. Because parents are busy and even in the indigenous cultures, the women were out doing washing, they were down by the rivers, they were planting corn, they were cooking and looking after children, the men were out hunting. So where did the education come from? It came from the grandparents to the children. And that link for me has been broken.
Yeah. I love what you've said about education first and foremost, that we are still in a teaching some very antiquated concepts. And also, while many countries and cultures say, oh, student-centered learning, child-centered learning, it still very much isn't. Maybe they have some pretty colors up around the classroom and they do a couple of activities, but they're really not allowing children to think for themselves. They're telling them what to think. And the testing and all the stuff that's happened, which is why Finland is doing so well. Yeah, they have the
Yep.
number 1 education in the world because they're allowing kids to be kids. They're letting them go out and play and explore and get dirty. And we are not seeing that, especially in this culture. And a lot of that has to do with, some of the really nefarious things, the underbelly of sex trafficking and worrying about whether or not your child is going to get abducted, and if there's going to be a school shooter, or I mean, just
Yep.
I'm so blessed to have grown up when I did, when I had the opportunity to go and play outside all
Yep. Yep.
day long.
Yep.
Nobody was looking for me. Nobody cared where I was. As long as I was home, by the time the street lights were out, we were good. All was good. I mean, it wasn't exactly the best era either, because the way that we were parented was a little bit harsh. However, we also grew up to be very self-sufficient, and we did have to think for ourselves. And we've got to, as an educator, not just working with young kids, but working with adult children, because adolescence goes up to 24 to 25 years old. So just everybody keep that out there. The brain is still developing.
Yep.
As an educator, there is this sense of entitlement, just because I show up, that should be enough. And no, that's not how it works. Like you have to put your time in. But also within the school culture as well, even though here in the United States, every state has some sort of clause in their state constitution, if you will, that says you need to teach morality or character development or whatever you want to call it, emotional intelligence, whatever name, social emotional learning. There's a million names for it. But people aren't even really doing that because the funding's not there. The teachers are stressed, so they slap a couple of posters up on the wall. They bring someone in to talk about bullying for 45 minutes, and we're good. We've got it covered.
Tick the box. Yeah.
Yeah, that
Tick
we've
the
ticked
box.
the box. In the meantime, they're spending a disproportionate amount of money on security guards and metal detectors. And it's just like, if you get your head out of your ass and put the money where it belongs, with making sure that children are really understanding the fundamentals of nonviolent communication and emotional intelligence, and you're giving them the training from the time that they're tinies, because you brought up a great point. I remember those things from when I was a child. That's when we learn. That's
Yep.
when all 80% of who we become happens before the age of, some say 6, some say 5, some say 4. Doesn't make any difference. You're really, really little. So
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
you gotta get it into their
Implement-
brains,
Yeah.
and it's like a language. It's a muscle that you have to build. So you start them in pre-K, you work them all the way through, and you keep picking away at these concepts. You keep teaching them, hey, but here's the thing, and I totally, this is probably a little conspiracy theory, but honest to God, I swear to God that the powers that be do not want us thinking. They don't
No, they
want us.
don't. And yeah, no, they don't. And for me, it's also it goes back to our education systems are still geared to the industrial age. It's
Yes.
still geared to the robotic production line. Don't think for yourself. Just do what you
Mhm.
have to do in your part of the production line.
Pass
You're
the
not paid.
paper backward.
Yeah. And you're not paid to think. You're paid to just do. And the education system still supports that way of being and doing, where we are moving into a world that is completely interconnected and it requires completely different skills and skill sets that in order to navigate the world that we live in today. And so, and this whole construct of teach people how to think, not what to think. Because when they can think for themselves, they become contributors as opposed to takers out of society. And
Absolutely.
that, again, it comes down to we see, and it is, we're living in a world that is on addiction on steroids in any shape, manner, or form that we talk about.
Hmm.
We're living in a world where there's a sense of and here in South Africa, it is on steroids. The level of
Here too.
entitlement, give me because it's my right, and if you're not going to give it to me, I'm going to take it.
Hmm.
And that shift from entitlement to being empowered, to having agency over myself, to being self-sovereign, those are the kinds of things that are the result of being embedded in a values-driven culture.
Hmm.
Because that's what I learned to do. I learned to have a voice instead of having my voice shut down. And 90% of a lot of the psychological problems that we deal with today is because people have they're not heard and they're having their voice shut down.
Absolutely.
Instead of creating the opening up and the opening into the creativity that comes from being seen for who I am and the part that I get to play in this tapestry that we call life, which for me is a huge opportunity. And it opens up a massive opportunity for the work that we like and love to and like to do. Yeah, we bash our head against the brick wall sometimes because the old systems are still so entrenched. But the glimmers of light are coming through. Finland as an example. There are other little pockets where you're starting to see the work that you're doing with Taya is just off the charts in terms of how we can instill values in Littlies. Um, some of the work that I'm doing around choice and choices, those are the kind of it does again, I come back to who's that one person who's going to make that difference.
Yeah.
You look at things like the Ron Clark story about what he did with kids in New York. There was that movie, The True Stories around Meryl Streep with violence and what she did with inner city children. Those are little pockets of light where it makes an impact and it makes a difference. We
Yeah.
might not, it's starfish syndrome. We might not be able to put them all back in the ocean, but there may be that one that is going to stand up and be that change that ushers in a different consciousness. And we never know. My job, show up. That's my job. Show up.
Yeah, no, that's true. It's going to be so critical for the future because here's the thing. We are, technology is outrunning us and we are
Yep.
not emotionally and mentally ready for all that's to come. And we've seen that. And one of the things
Yep.
that Stephen Hawking said, and many, not just Stephen Hawking's, but a lot of people have said, look, AI is going to take us down if, and it's going to be the demise of our society. And, but I don't think that we've ever really talked about why that's going to be. And well, some people have obviously, this really comes down to values because when we have values driving us, and I mean, when I say values, I don't mean, I'm talking about the moral compass that aligns with love, truth, peace, right conduct, nonviolence, compassion, empathy, kindness, whatever word you want to put underneath those, right? Integrity. Um, when we have those values, to be clear, driving things like AI or whatever kind of technology is coming, that's very, very different than worrying about who's behind all of that. And so
Yep.
if we don't, if we, the moral of the story is that if we do not get to the kids now, the children that are coming up, and we don't change the narrative to, uh, I, I mean, really what comes down to the difference between a high context culture and a low context culture. Are we going to do this as a self-serving machine or are we going to do it as a collective in Ubuntu? Which again, I just love that concept. It's so beautiful. And it's something I actually teach the kids here all the time and I make them shout it. It's just so cute. They're like,
The
this is
other
so cute.
element for me is it's also systemic. It's also systemic in the sense that we can't do stuff in a vacuum.
No.
So while things are happening, in the schools where the changes are happening with the children, if there's no support at home, what goes on is forget everything that you learned at school. You're now at home, and these children they grow up with this incredible sense of cognitive dissonance
Oh,
because
absolutely. Absolutely. The double
there's
bind
no
method. Do as I say, not as I do.
yeah, and there's no congruence between what they're learning at school and what's happening with the parents. And in many
100%.
instances, a lot of the parents today are actually needing to go back to because 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds who are being parents who haven't even grown up themselves yet with all the kind of stuff that's going on. I mean, we see
Yeah.
it here.
Yeah.
We've got a thing here. I'll never forget this. I was playing the Choices board game with a group of kids that were struggling, a group of girls. It was a girls' high school and they were struggling and I was asked to go and it was a pilot thing. It never went anywhere, unfortunately, but anyway, it doesn't matter. And I was playing with this group of girls and I had one girl standing next to me and she's going, I don't know why I'm here, I'm wasting my time. I said, what do you mean you're wasting your time? I said, you can learn something, you can make positive choices with your life. No, she says, she was in grade 11 and we
No.
also got 12, grade 12. She goes, no, she says, no, listen to this. This is beautiful. She says, when I leave school, all I'm going to go and do is find a blesser. Now, a blesser is an older man
Oh,
who she's basically going to sell herself into her form of prostitution because
we
she's
call
going
that a
to go.
sugar daddy. So,
Yeah, they call them blessers here.
okay.
So her ambition was to leave school and find a blesser who was going to look after her. Little does she know how that cycle will take her into prostitution.
Hmm.
Those are the kinds of ambitions that some of the kids are coming out with because that's what they're seeing on media as being successful. It's criminal. It's criminal, criminal. But anyway, we could talk
Yeah.
about that forever. We're
Yeah,
part of the
I
solution.
saw the same thing in Korea. I used to one of the things that I did as a job when I was working as a training specialist is I would also have to go out to schools and I'd have to listen to um, go to English speaking competitions. And I remember going to several all girls high schools. And, it was like, what do you want to do when like the topic would be, what do you want to be or what do you want to do when you get older or grow up or whatever, however you want to phrase that. It was always very rarely did I hear a young girl think she could make change. It was always, I want to have a nice car, I want to be thin, I want, like there was zero substance. And the thing that it always perplexes me when I hear parents say, I don't know where they got that from. It's like I okay, let's just deep dive, shall we? Like, what do you mean you don't know where they got? If a young girl has an issue with dieting, all I have to do is look at the parent. How many times have you probably said, "Oh, I'm too fat," or "God, I need to go for a run. I ate too much." Like or whatever you're doing, like kids are looking at everything around them. And again, going back to at what you said and what I said, the influencers are influencing that. And our politicians and our leaders and all of those people, they're looking at that. In this country, we have someone right now running for president who thinks it's okay to bully and demean. Like, you don't think that kids are watching that going, well, if that guy's doing it, then obviously it's okay. No, it's not okay. It's never okay. But this
Absolutely.
is always a reflection of what comes within us, which circles all the way back to that shadow components that's
Yeah.
either within us or structured outside. So there, I think we can both agree there's a lot of work. It's a
I,
little
I,
overwhelming. I don't know. There's just two of us.
I had the experience of when the Richard Branson School of Entrepreneurship was started here in South Africa. And it was the first intake. And I was called in to help these youngsters who'd gone through, there was a university that had been set up that had funding. It was through the Maharishi Institute. They were putting kids through a Bachelor of Admin. And the kids that weren't going to be successful, now get this, I love this, okay? The kids that weren't going to be successful, they decided they were going to put into the entrepreneur school. So they were struggling to finish their degree, and now they were going to put them into the entrepreneur school. So that was cool. So now, alongside this, you've got the academic qualifications that they have to meet with the unit standards based on the UK system, on unit standards and the syllabus and la, la, la. So as entrepreneurs, they've still got to do this work. And then they've got to now put a business plan together, which they now have to present to a panel. Now, some of these children have come from the rural areas into the big city, and it's the first time they've been exposed to it. But now they've got to put a sophisticated business plan together to a panel to see whose business was going to be funded. So, so I walk in the first day and I'm kind of going, and then we start off simply, okay, what business do you want to run? No, I don't know. Well, if that's the starting point that you, so I took them through a process that lasted a few days. They built up a vision board, and this is kind of speaking to exactly what you're talking about. So they had to present their vision boards to me, and they would have, so one had, I'm going to run a hotel. Nice ambition, wonderful. Trucking company, a catering company. I'm going to run my own shop. I'm going, okay, so I'm going to give you guys a challenge. You've got to do something between now and the end of this week. You've got 4 days to do it, where you need to make 100 Rand based on what your business is going to be. They're clueless around the fact that I'm going to run a trucking company. So where are you going to go to the bank and go and ask the bank to loan you the money to go and buy your first truck? And the eyes got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So the interesting thing with this was, and this is so endemic to what we're talking about. There were about 15 kids in the class, and I say kids because they were still they're young teenagers, or not young, they were kind of mid-teenagers, just over. 15 of them in the class. There was one, and she was a little itty bitty like this, and her English was still a little bit broken. She wanted to open what they call here in South Africa as a spaza shop, which is a little bit like a bodega, but on a much smaller scale here in the township where they call them townships where she came from. That's what she wanted to do. They got a stipend, and she used some of her stipend money to go and buy herself some flour and some ingredients to make what we call them fat cook. They look like little cakes that are deep fried. And she came to the school the next day and she sold her fat cook. Fat cakes, they called. The next day she came and she had her fat cakes and cheese. The day after that, she had fat cakes, cheese, and she had polony, or kind of a, I don't know what you'd call it there, but it's like a cold meat kind of thing. She knew how to make something out of what her dream was. She was able to diversify her product. She made money, and she had sales of 84 Rand for the week. She was the only one who made any money at all, 84 Rand for the week. She was the woman where she stayed, told her that she couldn't carry on cooking because they were worried that she was going to cause a fire. So she lost one day. If she hadn't have lost that one day, she would have exceeded the 100 Rand target that she had. They refused, they failed her business plan because they said it wasn't sophisticated enough. And she was the only one who was able to do what the task was.
Yeah. Well, that goes, I mean, that again, that goes back to, what we value as success. And,
Yep.
we
Yep.
need success looks like a lot of things, but I think we can, and this is something maybe we can both agree on and kind of wrap up here. But I think
Yeah.
success looks like how you not only treat yourself, but how you treat people in the world.
Yeah.
And are you successful because you are kind? Are you successful because you have compassion? Are you successful because you serve and help and want to see change throughout the world, and not change based on what you think people should believe or do,
Yeah.
but because you are genuinely interested in seeing kindness perpetuated throughout the
Yeah.
space.
And I think just to go back to the end of that story, when she came in and she could show her money that she'd earned, the money that she'd spent, and the profit that she'd made, you would have thought that you had given her the entire world in her hands. I still get choked up when I think about that experience. And it goes back to the fact that there were fundamental values that she came from that had been embedded in her, probably by her grandparents as
Yeah.
a little girl, that she then was a natural entrepreneur. And the system doesn't support that because she was thinking for herself. And
Well,
so,
I hope she's out there doing that, and probably, look at Mrs. Field. I don't know if you know what that is, but Mrs. Field's cookies. She makes
yeah,
chocolate chip cookies. That's it. That's all she does. Yeah,
yeah,
sprinkles cupcakes. Like it doesn't have to be big. Deepak Chopra once said, do what you love and the money will come. What is your
Yep,
passion? What is your purpose? What makes you get up in the morning? And if it's cakes, let it be cakes. There's no one to judge what makes you tick and what makes you happy. Um,
absolutely.
I, well, I mean, I'm going to judge if that's murdering people. If that's what makes you happy, then I'm definitely judging. But you know
Yeah,
what I'm saying? Like we're being silly here, but again, this really leans into again the values and volunteerism. How are we showing up in the world? And what I do a presentation. What's your personal signature? And one of the most famous signatures in our Constitution is John Hancock. How are you not just signing your name? But how are you imprinting on the world
mm,
around you? Because
okay.
you are doing it whether you like it or not. It happens
Yeah,
within 100 milliseconds of meeting somebody.
yep.
And Maya Angelou so famously said it also. She said, people don't remember what you did or what you wore or how your hair was, but it's how you made them feel.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
think that
yeah,
is such a beautiful, beautiful
yeah.
message. And Angela, I just if you could just quickly, we're going to wrap up here, but if you want to quickly share some of the wonderful things that you're doing and how people can get in touch with you. And I
Go
would
for
love
it.
to have you back. I think you and I could probably talk for probably
All
days,
day.
days, just about,
I've got one thing before I kind of give my little bit of the kind of credentials of where people can find me.
yeah.
Please tell us what 411 T Street means.
Oh yes. So 411 it's not 411, it's actually 411, and this kicks it back to way back in the day here in the United States. When you needed information, you dialed 411 and you got
Okay.
whatever information that you needed from a little person on the phone. And T Street, T is the as the kids today say, spill the tea, give me the information. So we are marrying the old world with the new world of
Exactly.
411 T Street. So it's just about
Amazing.
information.
Well, I just want to also give you the 11 as a portal. So the double one gives you the one gives you a
Yeah.
portal as well. So
Found
you're
the
accessing that. Yeah.
foundation and the movement through. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so you can find me on angelagalejames.com. I do a whole variety. I'm very multidimensional. I do a variety of different things. I'm an intuitive. I do readings for people. I do spiritual healing. Um, I do counseling. I also love working with entrepreneurs, both soul and social entrepreneurs. At heart, I am really an educator. I love what I did at 5 years old, and that was lining up my teddies and dolls and playing school with my blackboard and coloring in books and things like so. Exactly what I did at 5 years old is what I am very fortunate enough to do today. I can work in very many different contexts, from business to customers to not-for-profit spaces, to small businesses to corporates and anywhere in between. So, and this is what I love today in the way that the world is shaping itself is that we can be multidimensional. We don't have to go into a box.
No.
And we're seeing more and more of that coming out as opposed to, and it's not about being a generalist. It's the fact that we actually have so many skills and talents, and it's about molding them into a package of all the things that we can do. So, at my heart, I'm a facilitator, I'm an educator, I work with transformational learning, and I love telling stories the way that we tell stories in Africa with a narrative that is not about what's my brain story that makes me look good, but what are the narratives that embed values into the stories that we can use to teach. So I think that kind of sums it up. It's angelagalejames.com. I'm also on Instagram as Angela Gale James. I'm busy with a podcast that I've just launched called Sacred Spaces. And Milen, I'd love for you to be a guest on my podcast when we can talk about
I
sacred spaces.
I would love it. I would absolutely love it. And I'm definitely going to have you back. Again, I think we could probably do an entire series of segments. I don't even know. But yeah, it could go. Oh, I swear. Yeah, there's just so I'm really grateful for you jumping in and joining us. And we kind of hit on a lot of different topics, but yet, stayed within theme. And again, I just really respect the African ideology of Ubuntu, and I wish more people would adopt that even if that's not what they call it, but if they would adopt that, remembering that we are not an island, we need to do it together. Does
Correct.
not work alone, my friends. So
Correct. Correct. Correct.
I'm gonna we'll wrap up for now and make sure that everybody gets your information.
Thank
I
you.
will I'll have we'll share that with our audience. And I want to thank you for tuning into 411 T Street. Remember, transformation isn't just about one moment. It's about gaining clarity and understanding that develops meaningful change and brings us together. If today resonated with you, please subscribe and share, because inspiring moments create movement.
Incredible. And thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight as always. Looking forward to the way that things are going to be unfolding in terms of the work that we're here to do. And
Absolutely.
huge big gratitude to the fact that technology is what it is, that you can be sitting in the US, I'm sitting in Johannesburg in South Africa, and we can have this deep, meaningful conversation. So
Absolutely.
thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much.
Blessings, everybody. Thank you. And thank you for watching. Thanks for listening.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for tuning into 411 T Street, where we spill the tea on the stories that matter the most. Transformation isn't a single moment. It's the clarity and insight that drives meaningful change and connects us all. If today's episode struck a chord, hit subscribe and share. Let's keep these conversations flowing and inspire real movements. 411 T Street. Get the info, spill the truth, spark the change.